Before we move into the more practical applications of the methodology, I welcome the opportunity for us to pause and reflect on how we bring a uniquely Aotearoa New Zealand view to the practice, both of transition engineering and the question of climate change mitigation and adaptation. To help us do many of you will have heard some of Johnny's kōrero in the last few weeks as he's shared similar thoughts with the Climate Change and Business Conference and Water New Zealand TSS Forum. Johnny is based here in Tāmaki Makaurau and whakapapas to Ngāti Ata o Waihoa, and as a result is involved in the Puanui restoration program out in the Manukau, or adjacent to the Manukau. Johnny's going to share some of his experience directly out at Puanui, bringing a true kaitiaki view to restoration, and also some of the work he's done with Auckland Council in terms of bringing a Mātauranga Māori perspective to the climate action plan that some of you will be familiar. At the end of Johnny's presentation, we have a small amount of time for some audience questions on Slido. So please do get your device of choice out and feed through questions that you might have for Johnny as a result of his presentation. After morning tea, we'll have a more general Q&A. Focused around the kōrero that Johnny is sharing with us, as he's got other places to be after morning tea. So with no further ado, please help me welcome Johnny. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, mai Tāmaki Makaurau ki te motu, e mihi kawana ki nā kai whakatere o te hui nei, Brendan, Monique, nō reira, tēnei te mihi kia koutou. It's a real privilege to follow on from our two previous eminent speakers, and certainly in terms of deepening my own appreciation around transition engineering. And what I'd like to sort of share and talk about is how we locate Mātauranga Māori knowledge systems within the context of climate transition, climate action, but also how it could play a role in co-navigating that space from a transition engineering perspective. So, nō reira. So, the kaupapa of my kōrero this morning is, I call it te paioranga, and it's around navigating horizons of wellbeing. And at the heart of the outcomes we're talking about is around wellbeing and how Indigenous knowledge systems thinking can contribute to part of how we navigate that future. And it's one of those things that our ancestors are well used to navigating future, anchored in our knowledge and wisdom of the past. And so we use that metaphor of that voyaging in that way. And a bit like the COVID theme, where we're all in this waka together, and like climate action, and certainly from a Māori perspective, and we think about a wider context, is that COVID-19, climate transition, water crisis, poverty and equity, from a Māori perspective, is all the same thing. It's all about wellbeing. And what Māori knowledge systems offer is 1,000 years of lived experience within Aotearoa, on the back of 50,000 years of knowledge from the Pacific. So, and the methodology that Susan presented really aligns, and there's real synergy in terms of that in-time navigation around transition engineering. So, so just really want to short presentation, and want to have a bit more time to respond to any questions. So, Indigenous systems. Not just in terms of building towards a path break and And it offers an opportunity to reimagine, reframe and reset our current systems thinking. And we need to sort of depart from a pre-COVID way of thinking to navigate not just a post-COVID world, but how we navigate this climate transition. And both our previous speakers really spoke to that essence. And one of those key elements is how do we reorient our view, our perspectives, how we start to, I guess, recircularize our systems in order to regenerate our well-being. And so in an Indigenous sort of sense of worldview systems thinking, we sort of think in this double spiral intergenerational way of thinking and being, and our Māori term for that is takarangi, or this double spiral. So one of those points of being able to reorientate our view is often we need to relocate ourselves to the moon to really fully embrace the wonder of Papa Tuanuku, the Earth Mother, and Rangi Nui, the Sky Father, and as opposed to an earthbound view. So sometimes we need to change our location and reorientation to appreciate that. So one of those core elements in the Indigenous systems view is that everything is interconnected, and it's interconnected through intergenerational symbiotic relationships, which we use the term whakapapa, and anchored in people, place, and nature. And one thing we're observing is a convergence and transition. We're seeing in a Western systems thinking perspective a shift from square linear thinking and practice to more of a circular regenerative way of thinking and practice, which I sort of see that in my view, transitional engineering is actually forming a circular, interdisciplinary, holistic systems approach to solutions. And that circular, regenerative, transitional view really complements Indigenous Mātauranga Māori spiral worldview, which is intergenerational, which is well-being is anchored in whakapapa. So there's this wider shift of a circular worldview being able to co-partner, co-navigate with Indigenous spiral worldview, is that you've got these two circular worldviews that can work together in navigating that future. And so that's part of, I guess, this the shift from not just sustainability but to regenerative development and thinking, and transition engineering methodology is a means, or as Daniel Kenning spoke about, the how. And that's the critical thing, is that while we're all talking about the why, it's the how that how we do transition. And as an outcome, regenerate and transform the state of well-being. So in terms of Mātauranga Māori knowledge systems and practice, so it's a system of knowing, knowledge and thinking, experience and wisdom. It's anchored in a holistic philosophy, values and beliefs where everything, everyone, of the whole universe are interconnected through intergenerational symbiotic relationships. And that the symbiotic relationships form obligations and responsibility to those relationships. And within a Aotearoa New Zealand context, that wisdom, that knowledge has evolved over 1,000 years of observation, applied learning and practice within Aotearoa, and on the back of 50,000 years of knowledge, experience and practice throughout Moananua-Kiwa, or the Pacific, in terms of the way our ancestors voyaged, navigated throughout the Pacific. And I think one of those key differences of flipping the worldview in terms of a point that Susan made earlier is around flipping the perspective, flipping the orientation. And so our ancestors weren't system that held all the islands together. So it was about acknowledging the space that connected everything as opposed to trying to connect the dots. And so, and the other key thing is that the human wisdom, if you like, from Indigenous people was drawn from millions of years of memories and wisdom that's held within nature and within the land, within the geological forms. That's part of where wisdom sits, and nature drives its own solutions in that sense. And so So in terms of problem definition from a Māori perspective, is one of the things that while we come to terms with COVID and climate action, is that we also are reeling to the impacts of what I call squareization. That over the last 180 odd years, we've gone from a circular spiralward view to more getting encased in a square. And that's through the position of colonisation, urbanisation and westernisation. And so the impact of those square systems thinking has had a significant impact on those intergenerational whakapapa relationships. And that's reflected both in terms of the trauma of the impact for Māori people, which have manifested in the state of ill-being of our people, the over-representation of our people in prison, poor health, children in state care, and poverty. But that's also mirrored and reflected by the poor state of our bioecological systems around our harbours, our waterways, and nature. And the impacts on people, place, and nature reflect the degradation, disconnection, and displacement, and alienation from our whakapapa systems, and not just for Māori, but I'd suggest for humanity. A lot of people throughout the world have been displaced and disconnected from those whakapapa systems. So in terms of part of the how, in terms of the solutions focus, we sort of talk about the concept of te whaioranga, the pursuit of well-being, anchored in whakapapa-centred well-being, where the whakapapa sits between sort of people, nature and place. So often we're focusing on solutions in a human-centred context as opposed to a whakapapa-centred context. And sometimes in a human-centred context, nature and place have to pay the consequences. And so it's really about, at the end of the day, achieving balance between those whakapapa relationships between people, nature and place, in terms of how we employ Māori knowledge systems in the ecological, social, cultural and economic regeneration of well-being. So it's around operating within that whole living systems approach and how we reconnect physically, spiritually, mentally. We use the term whakaoratanga for regeneration. So it's about regenerating, restoring the mana, tapu and Māori of those intergenerational symbiotic whakapapa relationships between nature, people and place. And wānanga, and what was exciting to hear was around this in-time approach. And as I deepen my understanding of the in-time sort of thinking, I draw the equivalent of a Māori Indigenous sense of time, which we use the term wā. And it's not chronological time, hamster time, tick-tick time. This is about moments in space and moments of convergence. And so one of those critical things, which in reading the sort of transitional engineering methodology, is about the ability to evoke time and space whether we need to go into the future or travel into the past as we navigate the current state. So it's one of the, when I was reading through Susan's book last night, in time really resonated with that Māori concept of time. And this is really one of those lessons that COVID is teaching humanity, is the slowing down of chronological time and actually resyncing to the time of nature in the way that that convergence of past, present, future over generations, not just over 100 years. I think that's not necessarily long enough when we think about intergenerational timeframes. The second sort of point in around navigating horizons of well-being, and this is one thing that the methodology really resonated with me in terms of thinking about navigating current state, present, future. And this is a navigational model that our ancestors employed navigating throughout the Pacific when you're actually navigating through multiple horizons. And it's all about movement, nature's movement, the waka's movement, and the people in movement. So Pai Watu refers to our current position, our current state. Pai Tata is the space immediate between the waka and the horizon before us. Pai Tawhiti is the place that sits beyond the horizon and often sits within that 100-year or intergenerational sort of time frame. And one of the things, and it sort of touched on around part of the methodology around looking back in terms of history, but that's where the pai tawhito, that's the horizon behind us. And it's not just in the horizon of the human sense. So as I said earlier, Māori bring 1,000-year view, but the land, nature bring millions-year view. So part of that is not just looking back in a historical way, but this is where we look at the geological forms and other information to give us a really good picture of what those past states of well-being and ill-being have been in the past, and it puts both the current state and immediate future into context, and where, if you like, you start to look at those shift projects and transition sort of work. But the most critical thing is the term pairangi, which is represented by the stars. And we know in life there's ups and downs, and while you're aiming for a certain waypoint, sometimes that waypoint or destination point falls out of sight of whatever happens. So we're working towards climate transition, but then COVID hits us. And then our view shifts away from the climate sort of trajectory. But what pairangi really represents is where that vision, where the compass of how we navigate over time, how we navigate over space, where we also navigate through the peaks and troughs. So that our focus, where we want to ultimately end up, is always present in our view. And then just below on that diagram, what we're really transitioning and transforming is from a state of Māori noho, Māori mate, or stagnancy and ill-being, through to a state of Māori tū, Māori ora, which is around well-being and flourishing. And it's not just a linear thing, because it's a linear piece of paper, but it's a wider cycle where we go through cycles of Māori tū, Māori ora, back to Māori noho, Māori mate, and then back to Māori tū, Māori ora. So it's, and that's where that spiral intergenerational trajectory starts to sit around those cycles of well-being and the learnings we can take, as both speakers talked about, learnings from the past, the lessons, the wisdom, and the innovation, because certainly from a Māori perspective, adaptation, transition, and resilience aren't new things for Māori when we put that in a 1,000-year context. And prior to the arrival of the square system, our people were thriving and in tune with nature. The last 180 years, we've gone from that space of thriving to now surviving. And the opportunity through climate transition anchored around well-being is the opportunity to shift back to that space of thriving. And so in terms of how do we harness the Western science, regenerative thinking, transition engineering with mātauranga Māori focused on oranga and well-being, and this forms what I call a binocular view. And so this isn't about how do we engage with Māori, how is it that we co-locate, co-navigate with Māori's wisdom and knowledge alongside Western knowledge, and by just tuning in the middle bit between the two lenses of the binocular, we create this third view. And that third view is that future that Susan talked about, and how we can navigate to that space. And in the Māori sort of terms below, it's really about how do we harness the vitality of the land together with the essence of the people in order to enable the well-being of those whakapapa systems, the well-being of the environment, place, and people. And certainly for me, while there's a number of contributors, we need to boil it down to a common focus around whānau and family. Councils and institutions, professionals, we've got sort of part of that is, and I think both speakers talked about developing common language. And one of the key learnings around COVID is how our whānau bubbles kept us safe. We need to sort of activate and transition climate from that bubble perspective, and not necessarily about scaling up, but scaling out in the way the bubbles are likened to scales of a fish. And so being able to bring the value and benefit of both those knowledge systems. And just the thing to finish on is that we're applying all that thinking in a co-partnering way between our three tribal iwi of Te Waihua, Ngāti Te Akitai, Ngāti Tamoho, and Ngāti Chata in the Puanui catchment that you mentioned earlier. So underpinned through a strong mātauranga Māori approach with some regenerative thinking, But since sort of entering this realm of transition engineering, I think there's a real important place that transition engineering can play in this work, because it's about the how and about solutions focus. And so one of the big pieces of work that sits in this catchment is a development of the stormwater management plan. And we tend to do that work in a what I call a square engineering, a linear way. But there's a real opportunity, I think, how we could apply transition engineering thinking alongside Mātauranga Māori and really transforming the space for the benefit of the communities, the place itself, as well as nature. So I just want to finish on that and really leave our time for any questions. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Johnny. That was all too brief a walk through the amazing job that you do of straddling both the Māori and the Pākehā worldviews. A reminder to our participants around the regions that we do have Slido open, and we'd welcome specific questions you have for Johnny. There's a couple that have come through. I'm going to take a little bit of liberty in summarising a couple of them. As is often the way when we start to grapple with bringing a Mātauranga Māori worldview to our practice, we often don't know where to start. Particularly in the engineering context, we sometimes have hurdles to overcome in terms of time, budget, knowing who the right people are to talk to. And I feel like the Puanui catchment work is a really good practical example of actually both a transition engineering approach, but as close as I've seen to truly bringing a Mātauranga Māori view to life in a project. Could you give the audience a couple of how-tos in terms of what they could begin to do to replicate some of the outcomes or some of the approaches that you're undertaking at Puanui?
I think one of the things, and I think this is one of the issues of the current system, and a lot of it is driven within sort of a RMA context, which drives consultation and engagement. And I think we need to break path out of that, and because project level engagement is really about in the context of a project. And I think spaces like this convergent space are ways, so we've got to purposely create other spaces where literally we can just get together, have a cup of tea, a conversation, because in the context of a project, it's hard to build a partnership, look to co-navigate while you're also educating at the same time. And so it's almost like we've got to start thinking about how we prepare the garden together first before we start working in the garden. And so it's about how we create spaces. And we would sort of suggest that there's a basic sort of logic around what we call kaupapa, tikanga, and mahinga. And mahinga is around doing the work. We've got to sort of start back at the kaupapa level, where it's almost like exploring mixed methodologies, having those sort of conversations outside the time pressure of a project. What will flow out of, and so that first, our two first speakers really spoke to what I call the kaupapa of transition engineering. The next session is going to sort of move into what I call the tikanga, and which is around how to apply the principles of transition engineering. And then the third part is how do you then apply to a project, or the mahinga, the doing. So it's really about how can we evoke more that kaupapa level space for us to come together. And that's what wānanga, the term wānanga, is around exploring questions and in a way that trying to develop a sense of understanding. And often engagement comes from where the square view system is assumed, and we engage Māori and look for Māori input into the square, as opposed to we need to spend time to build that binocular view. And we've got some real eminent engineers, like people like Dr. Kipper Morgan, who've spent most of his lifetime in converging Mātauranga Māori and engineering science. So these spaces of convergence and certainly at a more local regional level, is creating space for us just to start to share and seek understanding and then work out that broader methodology around a binocular methodology of co-navigation, co-creation, and navigating that sort of past future space in that in-time way. So yeah, that's what would be my suggestion. Move out of engaging to relocating into exploring and seeking understanding.
Kia ora. There's a number of questions that are coming through that obviously the binocular view that you've shared has resonated with a lot of people, and I think the theme that I'm picking up from the questions is still around where do we start. And I wonder if obviously you can share a Tamaki Makaurau worldview, but are there forums or I guess other suggestions of learning that we could point people towards to begin bringing that binocular worldview to their practice?
I think one of those points of convergence is around climate transition. And so there's a number of iwi Māori climate action working groups in Tai Tukarau, in Rotorua around Te Arawa. So it's climate transition, climate action is that big world problem, that wicked problem that creates an opportunity for us to come together as people of Aotearoa beyond ethnicity in that sense. And so it creates that opportunity. And so there are a number of climate working groups that I'm aware of that are co-partnering with local government in that context, MFE and others. So I think that's something that we can help you guys do a piece of work to help identify across the country. They're more localised, because the beauty about mātauranga Māori, there's some common themes and principles, but when you get to place space, you get the nuances of those specific whakapapa systems. So our 19 mana whenua and Tamaki Makaurau will have a uniquely Tamaki Makaurau type response because of the flow and form and whakapapa of Tamaki Makaurau, just as Te Arawa would have a totally different worldview, but there'll be some common things. So I think that might be something that we could help communicate out through the audience in terms of a bit of post-convergence work to at least help identify some of those regional activations that are happening. So there's a lot of exciting conversations that are happening across the country.
I have a sense that many of the participants, particularly those who are upvoting, the last sentiment that I might share would really welcome the opportunity to keep connected on this and to actually progress from a shared kōrero here to the next level in their communities. It's a good reminder to everyone that, of course, this convergence itself is intended to just be the start of a conversation. And as I've said, we will share presentations and other learning resources with you post facto, and perhaps find a way to take up that offer of more localised introductions that Johnny's just put out there. I do want to actually just share verbatim, Johnny, because I know that you can't see Slido, but there's one question that probably you've actually answered, but the way it's written is really beautiful, and I want to acknowledge the author, who has thanked you for your valuable contribution. Love the Indigenous systems thinking and co-navigation concept. They then ask, in a practical sense, how do you instigate the co-navigation work in New Zealand? What's the starting point? And I think we have covered that off, but obviously, again, the way that it's written, we really thank you for sharing your ideas with us. If there's anything else you'd like to say as to how we get started, I'd welcome that as well. And it's still getting more upvotes, so it is definitely a shared sentiment.
I think too, in terms of acknowledging engineers, and one thing that really resonates with me in terms of in-time transition, transformation and movement, and is sort of the JFK early 1960s declaration of going to the moon and by the end of the century. And that was very much a solution-focused approach where new methodologies, new technology had to be created in order to fulfill the mission. and so and I'd be remiss to acknowledge one of my dad's brother, who was a lifetime engineer, and being Maori and bringing that sort of thinking, and so the innovation, the opportunity, and I think the key sort of point to leave is Māori mana whenua aren't just a stakeholder. We believe we are the whenua, and so place-based co-navigation starts with acknowledging the whenua and the human manifestation of the whenua through those mana whenua people. And I think if we were to start, it's about how we locate ourselves into place, into the whenua, and just acknowledging, and even to identify or discover who are the mana whenua of this location for this project. So that's where you start in terms of, because really what you're doing is partnering with the whenua in those sort of solutions, and that's what excites me about transition engineering. It's place-based solutions, and I would just sort of suggest or challenge a 1 degree shift from a human-focused solution to a whakapapa-centered solution. And if we just start to think like that, then it shifts the way we view things, shift that perspective, or flip the perspective, as Susan mentioned, and then start to think about how do we anchor ourselves into the whenua as we navigate that solution.
Well, team, I think Johnny's really beautifully summed up where we all need to start to at least understand who our local mana whenua are and begin to bring some of that spiral view to our work, which we can do in the absence of our clients perhaps always asking the right questions. It's also wonderful to hear that you see some really strong synergies between the in-time methodology and I guess emerging best practice around integrating Mātauranga Māori into these solutions. So it's really wonderful to hear that. I'm conscious that you've got the rest of your day to get on with, and I think it's time that we let our audience or our participants take a break, stand up, refresh, grab a cup of tea or coffee. But before I do, virtually, let's please thank Johnny for his contribution.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. So team, as I said, we know it's time for you to take a break, stretch, refresh, connect with your colleagues locally. For those of you joining remotely, we'll be coming back at, oops, help me out with our new timing, Brendan. We've shifted just slightly.
10:35.
10:35. Excellent, thank you. We'll be back at 10:35. So feel free to put yourself, well, walk away from your computer, and for those of you in our hosted hubs, enjoy that connection with each other over a cup of something. We'll be coming back after the break to go a little bit deeper into what I think is one of the most interesting examples right now of how our thinking can evolve based on the transition engineering methodology. So keep the questions coming into Slido. We'll also have a live Q&A shortly into the next session as well. So thank you all for your attention, and we'll see you after a cuppa.